Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of this new series on decision making in the face of uncertainty. Today's episode is all about making sense of chaos. And for this, I'm going to go back several years actually to the 1960s. You may have heard of the butterfly effect, some of you. And the story goes that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can create hurricanes in another part of the world. In the 1960s, meteorologist Edward Lorenz was studying weather patterns. And one of the things he discovered was really where this idea of the butterfly effect started. He realized that when he worked with data systems which were extremely interconnected, even very small differences created massive shifts in weather predictions. And I'm just going to show you the kind of graph that he was working with. So his discovery was that a difference as small as 1,000 of a unit could create dramatically different weather outcomes. And that's where this idea of a butterfly flapping its wings, creating hurricanes in another part of the world really started. But what does this mean for us? After all, none of us are weather scientists, or at least most of us I know are not. Um, when we look at systems that are tightly interconnected, chaos theory allows us to understand what change really looks like. And for a moment, just think about most systems that you and I are part of. There has been reasonable stability. Change happens, it happens incrementally, but nothing that completely upends our understanding of the world. What's different when times are chaotic is that many of the stabilizers or guardrails that we are accustomed to vanish. And when they vanish, small changes in one part of the system create tremendous impact in another part of the system. By the way, for another geopolitical example, I don't know if you're aware, but so much of our history was changed by a small admin error in the late 80s. Um, at that time, the Berlin Wall separated East Germany and West Germany, and there was pressure to allow people to move a little more freely between East Germany and West Germany. So there were talks, there was conversation around what would change and how travel restrictions would be eased. But on a press conference in November 1989, the official who had been designated to speak about some of these travel restrictions actually fumbled. And when he was asked when those travel restrictions would ease, he wasn't quite sure. He looked at his papers, he couldn't see a date, and he just said, as far as I know, from now. Now, that created a mass of people on the East Berlin side who wanted to obviously move to or visit West Germany. In that tension, because the guards at the wall really had no clear understanding of what they were expected to do or not expected to do, the Berlin Wall fell. So that's one example of how a small change, sometimes even an error like an admin error, can create tremendous consequences downstream. So, what is it that we can learn from chaos theory about understanding change? Well, one of the big learnings, I know the first time I came across it was during my doctoral studies. My PhD thesis, in fact, was using the complexity sciences. And for me, one of the things that was most interesting was that when we see a lot of disorder, we sometimes imagine that there is no order. But in fact, complex or very interconnected systems do have their own sense of order. But what is different is their sensitivity to things that maybe you and I may not have necessarily been conscious of before. To take another geopolitical example, the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is now under stress has created change that goes far beyond geopolitics. There are huge impacts for businesses, not just not just transportations, not just shipping, not just flights, But even LPG cylinders, as so many of us in India are aware of, or fertilizers, precious chemicals, etc. So, all of this is just an example of how, when a system is tightly interconnected and extremely complex, it's sometimes extremely difficult to predict the outcomes of change in one part to change in the larger system. So, what does that have to do with us as leaders? Like, why should it impact us as leaders? Well, it turns out that when we experience chaos as human beings, we actually respond to it in fairly predictable ways. One would like to believe that when we're facing uncertainty, chaos, and when times are difficult, uh, it brings out our most creative side. And certainly, I mean, if I were to go by movies, that would seem to be what I would predict. But in fact, one of the most documented phenomenon from the 1980s is something called the threat rigidity effect, which speaks about how, when we as leaders experience uncertainty and stress, instead of widening our scope to really understand what the bigger picture is, because sometimes the bigger picture is so complex that it is really difficult and hard to understand, we, in a sense, we revert to some very familiar cognitive shortcuts. One of them is that we compress the story, we make the story far simpler than it actually is. And that's a mechanism for us to make sense of complexity. It's easier on the mind. We compress a very complex event into something that is much simpler. Another thing we often do is we follow what everybody else is doing in the face of uncertainty. So if everybody is moving right, we think, all right, maybe they know something that we don't know. Hi, Anshuman, great to see you there. Maybe they know something that we don't know. And we tend to follow people much more when we are faced with uncertainty. And a third thing is, when we are faced with such high levels of uncertainty, we very often resort to waiting till we have far more data. So, what's interesting is that all of this is actually fairly predictable, and yet we're sometimes not quite conscious of. And these three, consequences of decision making in stress: compressing a story to make it more understandable, not more accurate, but more easy to access and understand, or doing what everybody else is doing because it's probably far less riskier, or just feeling almost paralyzed by the lack of information or lack of data and waiting till you have more, are some of the most common cognitive shortcuts. They're absolutely cognitive shortcuts that make decision making under high levels of uncertainty really, really difficult for leaders and all of us. So let me ask you, actually, and I see many familiar names as well. Hi, very nice to see you, Anil. Nice to see you, Vijay here. Uh, uh, can you think of times in your own life when, in the presence of a lot of uncertainty, you have thought of shortcuts that may or may not have served you? Because one of the most interesting things, and this is really at the heart of what it means to be a good decision maker or a good leader in what is so often referred to as the VUCA world, is understanding the cognitive shortcuts that we use. I'll add one more thing. As human beings, and I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Kahneman and Tversky, who really studied decision making in humans. And one of the things that they found time and again is it's really hard to make decisions with a lot of data. And because it's so effortful, most of us rely on shortcuts to decision making. Some of the most common shortcuts are, let's do what we've done before. That's the easiest. Or another shortcut would be, okay, this situation resembles this situation. Maybe I can do what I did here without necessarily understanding all that's different. Or sometimes as simple as, I will do this because that's the industry best practice at this time, or the industry-wide practice. And that's certainly a lot easier to do than really diving deep into thinking about that might be the best practice at this point in time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best practice. It's just probably the best practice, that we have at this point in time. So, what does that mean for all of us as leaders, and what is it that we can do? And today I wanted to share some very, very practical tips, actually. So remember, I said one of the first cognitive shortcuts is compressing a story. We take a story with all its complexity and all the interconnected pieces, but because it's just so much effort and it's so hard to follow the many, many actors in the many, many different parts of the world, we compress it. We make it really, really simple. So once we're conscious of our need to compress a story, there are two things that we can do. One is look at things that fall outside our story and be conscious of the fact that we are compressing it because it's easy for us, not because it's more accurate. It's easy for us. The second is we ask questions like, what is the ripple effect of what is happening? So I know I spoke about the Strait of Hormuz crisis, and we are fed information on that day in and day out. So I'm sure many of you are following all that's happening. There is a connection between economics and geopolitics that as business leaders, we absolutely have to understand. And I would even give you a thought experiment. We know that I'm going to try and be extremely polite here. We know that there is a challenge for the United States in using the Strait of Hormuz the way they would like to, and that they have asked for help from many other parts of the world. Here's a thought challenge. What happens if there are other parts of the world who do join in, or other parts of the world that do not join in? What might be some of the downstream consequences of that? And that's what I mean. Once we understand that we are operating in an environment which is highly interconnected, highly complex, because it simply has so many different players in it with very, very different interests, if we know that the better way to deal with a situation like this is to embrace the complexity and not try and oversimplify it too much, we can begin and ask ourselves some of these questions. What happens tomorrow if Japan joins? What happens if Japan does not join? What consequences are likely to follow? What happens if the UK joins, doesn't join? What might follow on the back of that? So that's what I mean. The first is follow the ripples, at least as a thought experiment. What happens if something that is yet to take place actually happens? What are the downstream impacts of that? The second is our tendency to follow the herd. As I said, in industries, it shows up as best practice mapping in perhaps its best form, or very simply, so-and-so is doing this, so-and-so is doing that, let's also do the same. And there is some wisdom to it, wisdom of the crowds. As we know, very often many people together are able to see a situation that's complex far better than one solo actor. But we also know that very often people are just following somebody else, not because it's the best way to do something, but it's just the easiest to get into. So once we're conscious of that, we need to ask deeper questions around whether the way others are dealing with this situation, whether it is the economic situation that's facing us, or even a geopolitical event, is really the best way for us. And the third is as I said, one of our cognitive shortcuts is let's get more data. Let's get more data. And it's perfectly understandable when there's so many moving parts. How do you make decisions? Today's situation might be different from tomorrow's situation. Tomorrow's situation might be different from day after. And those of you who are in senior leadership positions, those of us who've been there, are very conscious of the consequences of wrong choices. And yet, the faster the external change, the more the consequences of waiting to make a choice. So one way out is to, almost as a mental trick, make a choice that by this date, you will take a decision. And when you're waiting for that date, Of course, you can go ahead and gather more data, but the other piece is almost zoom out and be able to see the entire situation in its complexity, something that our very anxious selves are so hesitant to do. And I mean, if you think about it, it just makes perfect sense. As human beings, we have evolved from a species that reacted to threats of being eaten alive by a lion. And when we looked at a threat, our mechanism for fight, flight, freeze, takes hold. And instead of giving us, impetus to look at the big picture, and how would you, if you looked at the big picture, you would probably be eaten by the time you examined it, we rush we rush out of fear. So our ancestors survived because of that instinct. Yet the same instinct gets us into trouble. As we experience stress from the uncertainty around us, that stress makes us take cognitive shortcuts that most of the time we are not aware of. By the way, if you're wondering what this is, if you've ever walked into a meeting where there was a lot of uncertainty to start with, but then one person says something, and then everybody rallies around that person, or sometimes if that person is senior enough, then you probably have no choice. That's an example. Certainty doesn't mean accuracy. You can say something extremely confidently, and yes, people will rally around that sometimes, just because you're the only person who is speaking with confidence when nobody really knows what the answer is. But you can be quite wrong. You can be confident and quite wrong. So once we are aware of that, we have the possibility of making choices that are far better for us. So, as I said, what is it that we can practice? First, be very conscious that the system we are living in today is a complex and a system which is currently in chaos. And chaos does not mean disorder. It doesn't mean that. What it means is familiar guardrails have, well, not all of them have vanished, but many familiar guardrails have certainly crumbled or are looking very, very weak at this point in time, which means the system, which is our global economy at this point in time, is in flux. And when we are in flux and we are living in a world that is so highly interconnected, small shifts in one part of the world can have extremely large and disproportionate impacts in other parts of the world. So the moment we understand that, we know, okay, this is what we're really dealing with. And if we want to deal with this and make better decisions under this kind of stress and uncertainty, we absolutely need to bypass some of our cognitive shortcuts. Anshuman, you're so right. Our ancestors survived and then told stories. By the way, if you have been following storytelling over the last decade, I mean, it's had such a resurgence. It's become one of the most sought after business courses. But I will ask you this. While stories are great for conveying a message, they're also cognitive shortcuts. We love them because almost effortlessly we remember a lesson from a story, right? And for all cultures all across the world, within their mythologies, there's one or two key stories that almost like are the cultural backbone. And the cultural backbone for a reason, because they have a message that's super important for the culture. But here's the problem. Our stories are simplifications of reality. And if we believe them too wholeheartedly, we risk simplifying a world that is really not that simple at this point in time. So, so stories are two-edged in that sense. Great for communication, because if I told you a good story, you would remember what I said. So it's really great for communication. But as the user of the story, it's good to be conscious that a story is a cognitive device. It's a shortcut. It's helpful, but it's a simplification, and we lose out with that. So with that, I actually come to the end of this conversation today on using chaos theory to be better decision makers when we are faced with so much volatility and change. I hope you found the 3 practices of asking what might be ripple effects downstream, of making sure that we understand that our stories are simplifications and therefore seek out views outside of that, or set decision deadlines. And when we set those decision deadlines, zoom out and see the entire picture, as you might say, or the complexity of the entire situation in as much with as much complexity as our brain power will allow. So I hope you found that interesting. And if you do, please follow this series for more. We just did 2 before this. We did one on the conformity trap, which refers to how we feel safer when we do what everybody else is doing. And yet, when we're working in a familiar world, that really may not be the right choice for us at all. And we also spoke about curiosity and how different kinds of curiosity allows leaders to look at different kinds of questions. If you're interested and curious about any of these, look at the events page on my LinkedIn profile and you will find some of those replays. So with that, thank you all so much for joining. Samiksha, Avinash, Aditi, Anil, Anshuman, Kaushik, Vijay, and a few whom I'm sure I'm not able to read at this point. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And have a lovely Eid weekend. Bye for now.